Hi, I'm Andre from Bonsai Productions. I'm here with Hal Armstrong. Hal, how are you today?
Great, and thanks, Andre, for inviting me up to your house here on beautiful Muskoka.
Welcome. You're welcome. And thanks for coming and joining us. We're not in snowmobile season, but we're all about snowmobiling here at Bonsai Productions. And Hal, tell me something about yourself and who you write for.
Okay, so my history in snowmobiling goes back to 1968, so I've been snowmobiling every year since then, believe it or not. Started writing for the snowmobile media probably 20 years ago with Snowgoer Canada. Did a lot of their vintage time machine articles, and also did snowmobiler television. And from there, when Snowgoer Canada closed its doors, I started being a contributing writer for Snowtech magazine out of the States. And in addition to that, I have my Facebook page on vintage, all things vintage snowmobiling, and some new stuff thrown in called Time Machines.
Beautiful, beautiful. Now, I was going to ask you, there's been a lot of dispute recently about the origins of snowmobile ice oval racing in Canada and where it started. Now, I know you've done an article on this, and this is why the basis for our interview today. So, Hal, in your opinion, where were the first races in Canada for vintage ice oval racing?
Okay, so from the research I've done, and actually having lived in one of the locations, I'll give you my two takes. There could have been some other, impromptu racing in Quebec or Western Canada, but I do know of early winter carnival just outside of Barrie, south of here, in East Gwillimbury Township, where there was a snowmobile race held out on the ice, I believe, out on Lake Simcoe. I might have that wrong. But as far as the actual first oval race, they go back to the early 60s, just outside of Beausejour, Manitoba, which is just northeast of Winnipeg, and today is the Canadian Power Toboggan Championship. So if you go back in the history books, 63, Beausejour had a winter carnival like every little town did back in the day. Theirs was called the Winter Farewell. And they had all kinds of, curling events, hockey events, stuff like that. And of course, snowmobiling was taking off. There was a fellow locally in the town named Mike Bozak that was building his own power toboggans. And a power toboggan was the early name for a snowmobile, which was basically a rear engine mounted power unit with the cab on the front. They traditionally used a set of old, like 50s, 60s chrome car bumpers for the front, cut them in half, and used the bends for the ski loops. And so he had built those sleds. Polaris at the same time, just south of Beausejour, was building, obviously since the late 50s, the Hittines, the Snow Traveler. And so it was a big, interesting thing to have the Snow Travelers come up from Roseau and race against Mike Bozak's power toboggan outside of Beausejour. So anyways, those first races started there. And then in 67, they actually moved the races into town. And that's where, I think it was a 5/8 mile oval. It was a huge track. I raced there a number of times, and that's where the Canadian Power Toboggan Championships were held. So that's where you've seen, in the 60s, Polaris would come up with all these crazy new sleds with Mercury outboard powered Colts, and Skidoo would be there, and of course Arctic Cat and everybody else. And that was always held the last weekend in February. And then it, as it became more popular, 70, 71, that's when you started seeing, all the big factory teams coming. Now, at the same time, the Kawartha Cup outside of Peterborough was also maybe 2 or 3 years behind Beausejour, but that race was happening separately from the Canadian Championships in Beausejour, and I'd say it was 72. I raced in 72 there in the junior class, and that's when you know, the guys in Manitoba, Northwestern Ontario, Minnesota, Wisconsin got their first real taste of racing out in what I'll call our neck of the woods, you know, not including Peterborough, against the guys from down east. So that's when we had the Duhamel, the Skidoo race team come up. We had Bud Lee with the Speedways come from Barrie. There was a great team, I think it was Paul Prentice with their Skidoo race team, came out of Barrie, Huntsville, and they all congregated in on Beausejour. I remember that year. And so 72, Duhamel ended up winning the Canadian Championship that year. He had an amazing year. He had won the I-500, the Winnipeg to St. Paul, and had an amazing year with his big triple blizzards. And then from there we got Villeneuve. Gilles Villeneuve showed up in 73, which is the classic story of him with his Alouette Supers, showing up in his school bus with his little brother Jacques and just laying a beating on, you know, Polaris, Arctic, Skidoo, Rupp, you name it. He won everything that year at that race, and so it's gone on to there. Beausejour still is, you know, today the first event on the Champ and Vintage circuit. Happens every December, and then they have their final winter farewell race still in the end of February, early March.
Beautiful. Well, how can you also tell us what you do in your free time as a writer? Your job is to test snowmobiles.
Yeah, had a really sweet gig. Started with Snowgoer, and was able to, you know, on weekends. Snowgoer would always get 3 or 4 sleds from each of the manufacturers then, and so we'd book them out on the weekend and do a lot of riding in southern Ontario, Muskokas, up around Cochrane, putting miles on that. And then over the years, as that's diminished, I've been still fortunate enough to get sleds from Polaris and evaluate their new sleds. I've also been snowshoed out in West Yellowstone half a dozen times. I've been to the secret getaways with Polaris and Arctic Cat in northern Minnesota, running prototypes with you know, sled bras over them and everything, you know, not released to the public. So it's been quite an experience.
That's amazing. That's amazing. So what's up and coming for Polaris this year? Have you ridden the new 2-stroke turbo?
Yeah. This year for Polaris 2024 is kind of a holding year. They had some, definitely everybody knows about their quality issues. They had the fuel pump recall, they had the brake issue on some of the mountain sleds, and, you know, again, delivery on machines. So, you know, raw materials are still an issue even in the industry that I work in full time, so supply chain issues are still out there. So for Polaris, this is kind of a regroup year. I think it is for all the manufacturers, except Arctic Cat. And unfortunately, we just heard, you know, in the last couple of days that Yamaha is going to be pulling out of the snowmobile market after 2025. So it's, you know, for Polaris, it's kind of a holding year.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Are you planning on being at Beausejour?
I will hope to be at Beausejour. I cannot be there in December of this year, but I'm hoping to get there with my comrade out west and hit the last race of the year.
Yeah. Any other big plans
for
this summer?
This summer, believe it or not, it's July 2nd. I'm actually in the midst of putting together my first story for SnowTech. So I'm up at my sister's cottage here, so I get up early in the morning and I start going through my notes and photographs and stuff on some of the machines, topics I'm going to be writing about, because the first issue of SnowTech comes out in late August, early September.
Wow.
So
it ain't over.
So snowmobiling for me is a 365-day passion. Always has been. You know, with the mild winters we're getting sometimes, my family thinks I'm nuts, but hey, I grew up with it since I was in grade 4, and it's, you know, things you love. Hey, it keeps you young.
Well said. Well said. I think we're going to conclude this interview with thanking you for coming out in Muskoka and doing this interview.